This is a soil factory, and using it allows us to turn 100% of our food waste into compost for our garden. You can make one of these yourself with just 4 totes, 2 buckets, a handful of worms. With the exception of things like plastic and styrofoam, nearly everything will eventually decompose and become soil without us doing anything. It's only a matter of time. The length of time, though, is determined by a number of factors, and by fine-tuning those factors, we can create conditions that are designed to help decomposition happen more quickly. I'm gonna go ahead and start off right away by just showing you how this thing works. So there are 3 main stages within the system: the pre-fermentation stage, the pre-digestion stage, and the complete decomposition stage. Starting with the pre-fermentation stage, this part of the process is where we anaerobically ferment our food scraps inside of one of these. This is a bokashi fermentation bucket, and it's what's gonna collect and house our food scraps for pre-fermentation. Using this is really simple. You can either buy one like this or make one like this. I made this by drilling small holes in the bottom of one bucket and then attached this easy sealable lid. This is the top bucket. Then the bottom bucket where the food scrap juice drips out, you can put a spigot so you can drain it off easily. I actually prefer just putting in a high carbon material like wood shavings down there to soak up the moisture. And then the buckets just sit on top of each other like this. Either way, what we're doing to pre-ferment our food scraps is we're inoculating them with a specific set of beneficial anaerobic microbes and then pushing them down into the bin. Now you can buy these microbes in the form of a liquid spray or an inoculated brand. These are going to contain EM1, which stands for Effective Microorganisms 1. You can also make your own inoculant out of fermented rice wash, water, and milk that makes a batch of lactic acid bacteria whey. Check out our video if you want to find out how to do this. We show you how to inoculate your own wheat bran, or you can just use the liquid form. Whatever you want to use, you need to have some form of inoculant that will ferment and preserve your food scraps. So every time that you have leftover food that your kids chewed up and spat out on the dirty kitchen floor, not a problem. No reason to get annoyed. Just scoop it up and save it for the bokashi bin. Over time, the bin will fill up, and once your bucket is filled to the brim, you will want to let it sit for about another 2 weeks at least to make sure that every piece of food in there is properly fermented. Once 2 weeks has passed, we are ready to take this material onto stage 2, the pre-digestion stage. Now in this phase, we're going to make a mini compost pile, essentially. We'll talk about the anatomy of a compost pile in a little bit, but in essence, what we're doing here is we're introducing the anaerobic fermented food scraps to a carbon-rich material in the presence of oxygen. So at this point, we're converting to an aerobic decomposition process. I've got a 27-gallon tote, and I've drilled holes for aeration along the top of the container, and these are going to allow air to flow into the bin as well as let gas escape. Otherwise, and I made this mistake the first time, the bin is going to fill up with some really very strong odors, mostly ammonia, and that's not ideal. And then I just take my 5-gallon bokashi bucket, mix it up with some carbon-rich material in the tote. So what is a carbon-rich material? It's things like wood chips or wood shavings, dried leaves, shredded cardboard, and straw. And what's going to happen is that over the next 2 to 4 weeks, the lactic acid bacteria is going to give way to aerobic fungi, bacteria, and actinomycetes, and those organisms are going to consume and digest the broken down food material even further. You need a lot of dry carbon material to soak up the wetter nitrogen-rich material, that is the food scraps. And you really want to mix this up so that there aren't a ton of big clumps of food. There are a few other things that you can do to add to this bin. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but for simplicity's sake, after 2 to 4 weeks, we'll open up the bin, take a look to see if the food scraps are still visible. If they are slightly visible, that's all right, but from what I found, many of them just kind of disappear into the carbon material. Now we get to the final stage, and that is the complete decomposition phase, where we introduce the composted material to our worm bin. And the system that I have worked out right now is that I remove the contents of the lower bin and put it in 5-gallon buckets. This material isn't necessarily fully decomposed. It's not finished worm castings yet, but it can rock for another few weeks and decompose more until it's ready to be sifted. And that's where these buckets are at. So I'm going to go ahead and sift out the worms and the larger chunks of debris, and I'll be left with finished worm castings. Back to our aerobic digester tote. This material goes into the recently emptied worm bin tote, and it goes on top of the previous tote. Here I find it important to water the bin down a bit and just make sure that everything is properly moist. You can collect the leachate that comes out of it and dilute it, spray it on your garden beds if you want. Just make sure that you use it soon after harvesting so that it doesn't go bad. So there you have it in reverse order. We collect our finished worm castings by sifting them through our buckets. And then we've got our bottom tote of the worm bin that goes into the emptied buckets to finish decomposing. That tote becomes the top tote in the worm bin and gets filled up with the aerobically digested bokashi food scraps. The aerobic digester gets the next batch of bokashi food scraps along with a bunch of carbon-rich material, and the bokashi bucket is ready to start filling up again. Now, I want to break down what really makes this work and why each of these steps are necessary. I mentioned before that all organic material will eventually break down into soil. It's just a matter of time. And what dictates how long it takes could be broken up into 4 main factors. The main things I'm talking about here are temperature, moisture, airflow, and microbes. So by adjusting each of these 4 factors, we can adjust the decomposition speed. Let's take a look at each of the conditions in the context of a compost pile. The basic ingredients of a good compost pile are generally understood as nitrogen, carbon, moisture, and aeration or airflow. Nitrogens or greens are things that are grass clippings, other fresh cut green material, animal manure, coffee grounds, and fruit and veggie scraps. Carbons or browns are often brown in color. These are things like dried leaves, wood chips, straw, shredded cardboard. If you combine enough material, equal parts nitrogen and carbon, so that you get a 3 by 3 by 3 foot pile, adjust the moisture content so it's relatively moist and flip it every so often so that you keep reintroducing oxygen, you'll have it finished compost within as little as 3 weeks. When I refer to finished compost, I'm talking about material that looks mostly like soil. You can't identify many, if any, of the individual materials anymore within the pile. If you can see individual materials like leaves or wood chips or straw, you can always sift these out or just use the compost as a mulching compost where it'll break down into soil over time. So what happens here that makes this rapid decomposition work? Well, if we look at our 4 main factors, temperature, moisture, airflow, and microbes, we can see that in a well-designed compost pile, the moisture content, the airflow, and the microbes all stay consistent, and so the temperature will rise and decomposition will happen more rapidly. And this is called hot composting or thermophilic composting because thermophilic microbes are able to withstand temperatures up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas harmful pathogenic microbes will largely die off. But if we change one of the factors, the whole thing goes cattywampus. For example, if you had a lot of moisture but no oxygen, your pile would risk going anaerobic, and this would be indicated by foul smells and sloppy material and compost that harbors a disbalanced set of microbes, largely the putrefactive bacteria like E. coli and Clostridium. If we were to increase the airflow and decrease moisture content, then the microbes would dry out and their ability to function would be severely limited, lowering their overall temperature of the pile and slowing down decomposition so much that by the end of the first 21-day cycle, the pile would be completely unfinished. You would also get unfinished compost if you were to over-add carbon materials and use less nitrogen-rich materials, since microbes need both to consume, and a disbalance here would result in a pile that doesn't heat up and decomposition would slow. That's compost. And so far we've covered plant material, right? Woody materials, leaves, crop residue, kitchen scraps, manure, these are all plant-based materials and they break down fairly quickly when compared to animal products and foods with a higher fat content. The reality is, instead of composting plant material before using them in the garden, we could actually just leave them on the soil surface and wait for them to decompose, and it wouldn't take all that long. But animal products like meat and dairy, on the other hand, well, using a piece of beef as an example, let's talk through how this might be affected by these components of decomposition. If you were to take a piece of beef and increase the temperature, lower the moisture, and increase the airflow, maybe add some salt, you will limit microbial growth and eventually, done right, create a dried meat product that some of us enjoy called beef jerky. Now, this kind of heat generation relies on an outside source like an oven or a dehydrator, not the microbial activity as is the case for the compost pile. If you put a piece of beef in a container like a jar, add water, keep the air out, while boiling it, you will preserve the meat from decomposition because all the microbes are dead, and boom, you've got canned beef. Hopefully not going to decompose anytime soon. And there are dozens of combinations within these conditions that result in things like dry aged beef, cured beef, and many other ways of preserving meat that people have used to slow down decomposition. But let's take a look at fermentation. How do people ferment food? Well, obviously, fermentation increases a food's shelf life, which is very relevant, especially for most of human history when we didn't have refrigeration. However, another thing that fermentation does is it prepares food for digestion. Sauerkraut, for instance, prepares cabbage for easier digestion by pre-digesting and processing certain compounds like sulforaphane. This makes it easier for humans to digest because our gut microbes have less work to do to process the compounds in the cabbage. Another really interesting example of this is found in one of the national dishes of Iceland, hakarl, roughly translated fermented shark meat. Greenland shark was discovered to be poisonous to Viking settlers back in the 9th century, but by burying the meat for several months, thereby fermenting it, the urea found in the shark meat is processed via microbial digestion and made possible to eat for safe human consumption. This kind of fermentation, usually controlled by the addition of salt, which selects out putrefactive microbes, can also occur via introduction of an inoculating microbial culture. And that's where bokashi comes in. What's happening when we ferment food scraps with a culture, such as lactic acid bacteria or EM1, is we allow the bacteria to colonize the food scraps, partially consuming them. And they do this primarily by soaking up simple sugars from the food and excreting lactic acid, which then lowers the pH of the environment, meaning the environment becomes more acidic, which means that it becomes inhospitable for pathogenic microbes. And that's the basics of this kind of anaerobic fermentation. So back to meat, dairy, and food that's been cooked in fat, why can't we just put this straight into a compost pile? Well, we could. However, relying on aerobic bacteria to just immediately start to decompose the meat isn't quite realistic. A workaround would be something like an industrial composting setup, where the temperatures get up way past 160 toward 180 or even higher. And then at these temps, proteins begin to unravel, fats liquefy, and the overall structure of the food erodes and becomes much more susceptible to decomposition. But this is far from ideal because at temperatures above 160, you're killing off the majority of beneficial bacteria and fungi in the material. The better course of action is to inoculate your meat and dairy waste products before introducing them to a compost pile. Especially for a home compost pile, if you try to throw meat in there, you'll likely attract rodents and scavengers or fly swarms, and odors would not be pleasant. With bokashi, there's a slight odor, but it's more of a pickly sweet scent in my opinion, and because of its acidity, most animals are not attracted to it. I've never had a problem with rodents getting into my compost piles when I've incorporated bokashi in them. Now, a question that you might be asking is then, why go through all the effort to create this system if you could just hot compost your bokashi food scraps in a few weeks, or even just bury them in the garden? Both are totally legit uses, by the way. But there are three main reasons that I see this system as actually potentially really useful for gardeners. The first being, if you are growing in a small enough space that doesn't allow you to have a huge compost pile, if you've got a patio garden, but you still want to make your own amendments or even just utilize a waste stream, you could find this system very useful, I think. Especially if you're just one person living in an apartment or a couple living in a small townhouse, you could scale down to smaller totes and buckets and get the same result. Cassidy and I have 3 small children who waste food. We make bone broth and we have leftover meat and veggie scraps. And sometimes you just accidentally leave leftovers in the fridge too long. Waste, unfortunately, happens. So for us, we need about 4 bokashi bins to keep us on track. We fill them up just about every 2 weeks, which gives us time to age them properly once they're filled before we empty them into the aerobic digester bin. And this brings up another reason that you would potentially want to use a system like this, is because I don't always have the space or the ability or materials to make an entire 3 by 3 by 3 foot compost pile. And so my bokashi bins just fill up and I have to wait until I'm ready to make one. With this system, we're able to slowly convert the food waste material into soil as we go about our lives, and this allows us to always have somewhere to put our kitchen scraps. The last reason that I see this option as potentially really helpful for home gardeners like myself is that the end product is of very high quality. Worm castings are kind of seen as a super compost. They're great for general use in the garden. You can make aerated worm tea out of them, and especially with this system, we're getting nice microbially diverse batches of castings. Now, there are a few things that I will recommend for this system that are really going to take it to the next level. And the first one is more or less an essential, and that is because bokashi food scraps are acidic, it means that critters generally stay away from them until the aerobic soil microbes have colonized and begun decomposition. And by that point, the pH will have risen and they'll be well on their way to becoming soil. However, this poses a risk to worms in the worm bin, or at least means that you might annoy your worms if your bokashi scraps aren't decomposed enough. So a safeguard here, and this may not be necessary, but I like to do it just in case, is to add crushed up eggshells to raise the alkalinity of the environment and to help balance out the bokashi acidity. I mix up the scraps with a few handfuls of eggshells, crushed up eggshells. These are really finely ground. I usually use my food processor for this, so consider that an option. Another general upgrade that you can make for your aerobic digester is to use multiple sources of carbon. The more carbon sources, the more types of fungi and bacteria you're going to encourage to grow, and we want a lot of them at work. We're going for diversity, so this is a pretty low and gentle approach overall to decomposition, so there's really an opportunity for microbial diversity, which brings us to the next upgrade, and this one is a no-brainer if you have it, and that is for your aerobic digester, adding in an additional microbial inoculant, such as a shelf-stable dry JMS solution, a Jadam microbial solution, and or IMO4, which is indigenous microorganisms 4. These are both Korean natural farming inputs that contain massive amounts of microbial diversity and will help the whole process run smoothly. Again, the gentle low temp approach we've got here is really accommodating to maintaining that microbial diversity in JMS and IMO4. They're also going to keep smells in check. So if you've got them, add them. And if you want to learn how to make them, you can check out our other videos. And finally, the last upgrade, and again, this is a no-brainer if you've got it, is biochar. Add activated charcoal to the aerobic digester, whether it's charged or not, because it's going to serve as a home for all of those awesome microbes that you're culturing. It's going to last forever in your garden soil once you incorporate it. Charcoal will also help soak up nitrogen smells and all of that, so definitely add a few handfuls at least to each bin. This is a great usage in my opinion. One final thing that I will throw in there is that while the bokashi process is primarily something I advertise as a way to convert your meat, dairy, and cooked food waste into soil, you can also ferment any other green material from your garden. Things like comfrey, leaves, yarrow, grass clippings, crop residue. And the reason that you may want to do this is if you are actually just trying to stockpile enough nitrogen sources for a compost pile to make it heat up. When you bokashi ferment these ingredients, it locks in all of the nutrients, nitrogen included, which is often the weakest link that we're most lacking when we go to build a big old hot compost pile. So if you are getting a ton of green material, throw it in the bucket and you can either run it through this system that I just outlined or store it for your compost heap. Either way, this method is extremely effective and helpful for natural gardeners like myself. And so guys, that is how we turn anything into soil. Of course, when you're gardening on a large scale, you always need more compost, better soil. So I'm happy with this setup. If you found this video helpful or informative, you will definitely want to check out our complete guide to bokashi, where we teach you how to make your own bokashi brand and how it all works. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.